So moving over to video number 2 now to carry on talking about NVLD and its overlap with Asperger syndrome. So it has been suggested that there is a subgroup of non-verbal learning disability. In fact, there are subgroups of non-verbal learning disability. I guess a bit like there are subgroups of autism, really, more generally. Bearing in mind that NVLD itself isn't autism per se, in the sense that obviously you can have NVLD profile without being autistic, at least in theory, but it's extremely common for people with Asperger's to have this profile. That's why it's often been said to be almost like the classic embodiment in neuropsychological terms of Asperger's, but obviously we must be careful because not everyone with Asperger's will have that neuropsychological profile, and it's presumably only a subgroup of people with Asperger's will do so. I guess a bit like if you look at classic autism, there's like a stereotypical kind of idea of what it is, but not everyone with autism will embody that stereotypical profile. I guess actually I am pretty stereotypical as an Asperger's person. It's funny me saying that, because I am extremely stereotypical when it comes to my neuropsychological profile, but because I'm female and because my interests aren't stereotypical, that may well have been what led to me, resulted in me having to wait years for my diagnosis. Whereas if I was male, and if my interests were a bit more like, I don't know, I guess also, and also I think also lack of awareness, actually, to be fair, because I know lots of boys who also weren't picked up in the 90s because people just, I think if I was growing up now it probably would have been very different because there's so much awareness now. I mean, my social difficulties were pretty obvious right from day one when I started school. Is pretty much the first thing the teacher said to my parents. So, yeah, it's a bit weird they didn't, it's weird and it isn't weird, but like I said, back then they didn't have enough awareness, so that probably explains a lot of it. Sorry, so what I was saying is that, it's proposed that there are subgroups of non-verbal learning disability, and one of these groups includes social difficulties. So it's been suggested that there are different subgroups of non-verbal learning disability. One such subgroup will also include social difficulties, but it's possible for someone to have extreme visual spatial difficulties and all those other problems without social difficulties. But because visual spatial deficits, when they're very severe, are obviously going to affect every single aspect of a person's life, it's very common for them to also cause social difficulties, just because if you've got visual spatial difficulties, it's going to make it a lot harder for you to read people's facial expressions, which requires visual spatial processing. It's going to make it a lot harder for you just to process everything, because like visual spatial skills and non-verbal reasoning and everything kind of affects everything. It's kind of pervasive. So, but it is possible for someone maybe whose non-verbal difficulties aren't quite so extreme, maybe not to be so impacted on the social skills. So it's suggested that there are various subtypes of NVLD. Only one subgroup includes social difficulties. Usually the more severe forms of NVLD, by definition, will include some degree of social difficulties. But it says here, Byron Walk's 1995 research focused primarily on a combination of neuropsychological assets and deficits that produces as a byproduct poor social relatedness, that Michael Buss describes as characteristic of only one group of NVLD, but Walk suggests that Walk kind of emphasised the social difficulties though. He seemed to think that they were a lot more common in NVLD. So Walk said that the primary deficits are in visual perception, ability to process novel material. This then results in secondary deficits in visual attention, for example, and then tertiary deficits in visual memory and concept formation. Yeah, it said in my school report that I had difficulties with visual memory, so that's interesting. And also extreme perceptual difficulties in spatial areas. So. Also assets in auditory perception, which is interesting. I think the auditory perception assets can mean that the person learns to read pretty early, because if you think about it, that's to do with it's kind of the opposite to dyslexia really, because that involves kind of phonemes and stuff. The problem with NVLD is problems of comprehension. The person often learns to read very well, but they don't have an understanding, because they can't kind of, I guess that involves spatial skills as well, but it's an organisation abilities. They can't kind of bring together the text to create a coherent meaning. yes, auditory perception is often very good. And simple motor skills can also be pretty good as well. Simple motor skills and rote motor skills. So anything that's basically been routinized and made rote. I guess a bit like me with my knitting, which has become routinized, so I can do it well. But anything that's novel initially takes a really long time to process, and anything that's complex and involves a lot of sort of spatial information and that can't be routinized or made rote, the person will really, really struggle with. Particularly anything that involves kind of manipulating objects in space, such as tying shoelaces. Once it's become routinized and rote, the person can do it, but it's like the learning can take a very, very long time, as indeed it took me years to learn how to tie my shoelaces. I can do it now. It took me years. And so those assets, auditory perception, simple motor skills, and processing routinized material, can result in social emotional deficits when they're combined with the problems I mentioned earlier. In awful situations, people with non-verbal learning disability rely on rote behaviours as they excel in rote, routinized behaviours. That's probably why reading can become very fluent, because that's a rote, routinized behaviour. Once you've learnt it, it can become very quick. You know, it's like mechanical, basically. Interestingly, by the way, another neuropsychologist called Badian in 1983 described children with poor social skills and anorithmetria. So there's actually been quite a lot of research historically into the conjunction or association between difficulties in maths and arithmetic and social skills. It's quite interesting that often, but not always, if someone's got really poor arithmetic skills and math skills, there's often an overlap with that and social difficulties, which is really interesting, because obviously I'm not saying it doesn't always occur. Like, it's not the case that every single person who's got like dyscalculia and things like that is going to have social difficulties. Obviously not. There are lots of exceptions to that rule, but there does seem to be a very strong overlap between the two, suggesting that maybe there is some kind of shared cause between the difficulties in maths and the problems in social skills, I guess particularly if they involve spatial deficits. And there seems to be a heavy overlap between this profile and Asperger's, as I've already mentioned. But obviously not all people with Asperger's must be a particular subgroup. Children with non-verbal deficits of learning, such as visual spatial, may or may not experience social deficits. Walk noted that NVLD applies to children with Asperger's, but some claim that NVLD is separate to Asperger's. So there was a lot of debate about this, which hadn't been clarified by the time they got rid of Asperger's from the DSM. Now we're never going to know, because they got rid of Asperger's. It's also been suggested that maybe NVLD is behaviourally distinct from Asperger's, but with neuropsychological similarities. In other words, both Asperger's and NVLD share neuropsychological similarities. So the neuropsychological kind of tests will reveal very great overlap between Asperger's and NVLD. So people with NVLD and Asperger's will often share the same learning profile, which is distinct from other types of autism, such as classic autism, where it's often actually the other way around, which is why many people are arguing for Asperger's as a very specific profile, and that's why there was a lot of anger when they got rid of Asperger's, because it's not really helping people. Personally, I think it is a very specific profile, and I think it's a great mistake to get rid of Asperger's. Particularly as I share it so classically, the profile, I find it quite insulting actually that we got rid of it. Maybe I should actually start saying I have Asperger's again, just to offend people. Oh no, good. And people say, well, you got rid of Asperger's. I don't care, you know, it describes me, so just go off. Yeah, seriously. You know, I'm classic Asperger's and I have it pretty severely. That's kind of what I want to say. It's a very distinct profile. It describes me perfectly. And nowadays, you can't Google Asperger's syndrome, because the only thing you come across now is the old articles. And that isn't very good, because like when you want a very specific thing describing you, the thing is, like, people nowadays, they say, oh yeah, it's all part of the wide autism spectrum and stuff, oh it's all the spectrum, but that doesn't really help, because there's no, I like to have specific profile kind of demarcations. I like to have categories, I like to know exactly where I fit. With Asperger's previously, I did have that kind of sense of satisfaction of knowing more where I fit. Now it's like, yeah, anyway, that'll take another video. So it seems Asperger's and not NVLD share neuropsychological profiles, but Asperger's is distinguished by the repetitive, obsessive behaviours, activities and interests, which is not part of the NVLD description, but like I said, a very large number of people with Asperger's do have the NVLD profile. So in other words, they have Asperger syndrome with the NVLD profile, in other words, but not all people with Asperger's will have the NVLD profile, or won't have it as classically, and likewise, not all people with NVLD will have Asperger's syndrome. Okay, so I hope that makes things a bit clearer. Thank you for watching.